And hello, Year 12 students. We are going to go through from page 135, I believe, 135. And we're going to go all the way through to 156 today. So we're going to just summarize the key things in that section. So let's begin. So it begins by Lieutenant Rook, who's recognized that this comet is not going to arrive, and so he knows that soon his time as the astronomer out in his own section is going to end at some point. But interestingly, something happens, and he finds out that the natives just start arriving at the settlement. So it starts off, Bowenbar arrives first, then Warrangoon arrives, and a whole bunch of them, like they've had some sort of meeting, tribal meeting, and maybe they've decided after over a year these guys aren't going home. May as well, we've tried silencing them out, but they decide to actually come and join them in the settlement. Interestingly, and something to note here, the contrast between the natives, who are only clad in their skins, and the Captain Silk, in his breeches and jacket, was like a sum that did not add up. And we'll see a lot of juxtapositions, a lot of things that are next to each other and opposite to each other in this next section. So the section itself is called the names of things. So if we come back, okay, and that is also symbolic of, well, learning language, because Rook starts to learn the language here, but it's there's a quote later on which is about the true names of things, and that represents the friendship between Rook and Tagaran. Anyway, so we're on page 136 now, top of 136, and the natives, so the description in this early section of the natives arriving in the settlement, and they're just making themselves at home, popping into huts and just inviting themselves wherever. And I read this and I think to myself, wow, the natives, they didn't have a sense of ownership of the land. My house, your house, my space, your space. It was all kind of one with nature. And so you can see that in the way that they are portrayed by Grenville as wandering freely in and out of the huts of the settlement. It starts with a description here, and it's quite symbolic, 137. That is a description of how this grey-haired man wanders into a hut, and there's a woman inside the hut next to the fireplace in her apron, so a British woman, and the men walk around the room and they're picking up things. So they're picking up a teacup, a fork, a clay pipe, so they're kind of sniffing and making remarks to each other. One picks up a piece of bread and sniffs it, and another dips finger into tea, and licks his finger and then grimaces. Another picks up a china plate and then tries to eat it or tests it with his teeth. And Rook notices that this is the first time they've seen a teacup or fork, the only time they're going to need to taste a china plate. It will never again be the first time. And Rook was aware of witnessing something unrepeatable, irreversible. He was watching one universe in the act of encountering another. And I thought that quote was certainly worth filing away. One universe in the act of encountering another, and also unrepeatable, irreversible. This is a quote that you can use when the two cultures, the natives and the British, begin to interact or have intercourse, as Kate Grenville would put it. But we also notice at this same time there's some derogatory language that's used by the British to describe the natives. They call them savages. And later on, page 139, if you they're savage, dirty, filth. Okay, so some natives describe them using quite derogatory terms. But let's head over to 138. And there's a description in the middle of 138 of a man called a barber who happens to also be a barber. And in his hut, he's actually shaving somebody, and then the natives, so the grey-haired older man comes in and they watch as this man is being shaved, the customer is being shaved. And the natives weren't alarmed or apprehensive. It was like they are putting on, the white men were putting on a performance for them. And the barber seemed to, like, he flourishes his towel and whips the towel away with a flourish and then invites them to sit in the chair and get shaved themselves. At which point they take a feel of the steel or the blade and decide against it. And towards the bottom of 139, the contrast between rook and silk is emphasised here. So here is a deeper contrast. So there's another juxtaposition of rook and silk, and they are opposites. Rook is mathematical and analytical and all about systems and logic, and silk is smooth and about poetry, flowery language and storytelling. But here is about how they encounter difference. And silk, when he encounters different, his impulse was to make the strange familiar and transform it into a well-shaped, smooth phrases. So he takes something different and wants to make it something familiar. Whereas rook, when he encounters something different, wants to enter that strangeness and lose himself in it. So there's a real contrast in the way that rook and silk deal with something that's different. And then we're going to move on to the next section, which is a new starred section, but we're going to continue. So rook begins to learn the language in this section. So on the next morning, after the natives have appeared in the settlement, a bunch of natives start arriving at Rook's hut. So his observatory out in the headland, the peninsula away from the settlement, they start arriving, and Rook decides he's going to try a different approach to how he did it last time. So last time he cheerfully says good afternoon, and this time he sits, doesn't look at them, make eye contact, and waits. And that's described there. And one of those men who is there is Warrigan, and Warrigan comes and sits with Rook, and you can tell Warrigan's trying to teach him something. He's trying to teach him this word. It sounds like burrel, and Rook is trying to say it and he's speaking like an infant might, burrel, and Warrigan kind of nods, as close as he's going to get, and then he mimes a telescope up against his eye and looking further away. Burrowell, he says. And Rook understands that it doesn't mean a telescope, but it actually means what the object does, and that is not a telescope, but something that means a great distance off. And so Warrigan points at across the shore, Camaragal, himself, Gadagal, and then he points at Rook and says Berrawelgal. which means the tribe from far away or a great distance off tribe. And there's a description here of when Warrangun touches Rook's chest on his red jacket, the first touch between two separate beings. And he almost expects a flash or lightning because it's so significant. That's like the first time that they are genuinely encountering each other. So he realizes that he's been named. The name of their people is Berawilgal, the great distance off people. And despite their incredible ships and guns and telescopes and all of them things, they are just another tribe, the great distance off people. And of note here is the natives' attitude towards Rook and his hut. They pretty much ignore him. He is nothing more remarkable than the tree, rocks. It's just also that reverence for nature and the whole of nature in the environment. The other thing I noticed here at the bottom of 142. No, we're on 144 now, sorry. 144, here in the middle of 144 was the description of the language, that the words were opaque, they can't see through it, which means it's very hard for him to hear or even understand. And trying to hear its form was like trying to take hold of running water. And I thought that could potentially also be symbolic of the cultural difference as well. And then it shifts to this lady who comes towards his hut, a description of her lean and wrinkled, but full of dignity. And she makes herself at home and wanders into his hut and starts to feel the blanket and touch his Montaigne, his book. And there's some kids that were with the women that are now kind of darting in and out and Rook is interacting with them. And then page 146. They're continuing, they play with his shaving things, and 147 is the first meeting with Tagaran. And Tagaran is the the second main character, one of the main characters, the secondary protagonist, I guess you could say, to the novel. She's maybe 10 or 12 years old. She's skinny with a long, graceful neck and an expressive, mobile face. And he recognizes something in her, the same feeling he's feeling himself, or the same impulse. Excitement tempered with wariness, the desire to explore held in check by the fear of making a wrong move. They're similar. And he also notices that she was like Anne at 10 or 12. She reminds him of his sister. She's dark-skinned and naked, so she's nothing like Anne, and yet he saw his sister in her. Something about her character, perhaps, or her, the way that she sees the world. And there's this description of them. She uses her finger to touch his palm. And then the next 2 pages, she starts to teach him a few different words, mare meaning wet, and we turn over to 150. All right. On 150, there's another description of Tagaran at the top. She has an expressive face, a vivid personality, and he teaches her his name. And then they learn each other's name here, Rook and Tagaran. And he begins to write the new words he's learnt, and they say goodbye. And 152, after saying goodbye, he finishes writing his words, and then he notes that language is not just a list of words. Anyone that's learnt a language knows that. It is a collection of fragments all jumbled together like a box of nuts and bolts. Language was a machine. So there's two similes used here. Language is more than a box of nuts and bolts. It is a machine, and you need to understand all the parts in relation to all the other parts. So it requires someone who could do more than just collect words and learn them by rote. Somebody who could dismantle the machine and see how it works. A man of system, a man of science. Note the repetition there. That's called anaphora when we have repetition at the beginning of a phrase. A man of system, a man of science. Emphasizing that such a man is Daniel Rook. And there's a sense of destiny in the bottom here of page 152. Everything in his life had been leading here as clearly as a map. Because he was born with the urge to understand how things worked. He could read in 5 languages, and he loved difference. So it held no fear for him. He knew that strangeness was commonplace when you inhabited it. Because he was strange, he didn't fear something strange. Okay, and also his temperament, the same qualities that made him such a diffident social being. And he knows this with as much certainty as he knows his own name, that this is his work, this is his destiny. And then there's a section here on page 153 where Rook imagines himself presenting his knowledge to the governor. He imagines Silk kind of acts as his ambassador and presents him to the governor, who's Lieutenant Rook has found the basis on which the native language is founded, and the governor would be astonished. So this whole section is just his imagining what would happen if, and it indicates a desire for recognition, perhaps fame, and it quickly jumps out of that, other than the note on page 154 that it would be a huge discovery, and the top section here, a discovery even greater than Galileo or Kepler, because those great scientists built on other scientists' work, but his work was hitherto unknown. And that's something you'll see later too, on the next page when we get there. So then he plans how to make a list of words and sounds, how he's going to document these words. He comes up with a way of documenting the alphabet and the sounds, and he plans a list of verbs that he's going to collect: eat, walk, drink, yawn, creep. He's starting with verbs he can act out in the beginning, and then he's going to work out how to conjugate that language. And then we're going to finish page 156 with this. He recognises how extraordinary this task would be. And even Kepler, Newton, all those great scientists did not have a blank slate or a tabula rasa, it's a Latin for blank slate, but had built on other men's work. But he would be doing something truly extraordinary because he only had his ears, his pen, and the notebooks. He has a tightness in his chest that tells him after a while he doesn't know what this feeling is, but then he recognizes it's because he's in the grip of a vision. And one thing I noticed there was this tabula rasa as a quote. It could potentially also represent Rook himself as a blank slate. In terms of human relationships, in any case, when he arrives in New South Wales, he has limited social interactions and social skills, and he's like a blank slate that's being written on. And by the end, he's actually a fully formed human being, as Kate Grenville herself says. So that is page 135 to 156. Make sure you've got your summary notes about the main ideas and also quotes. Keep it up, guys.